Everybody, welcome back. This week we're going to look at early childhood. So our unit learning objectives for this week include, I want you to be able to explain and identify examples of the initiative versus guilt psychosocial stage. Distinguish between and identify examples of gross and fine motor skills. Identify and explain the related stages of cognitive development using the theory terminology appropriately. Explain and provide examples of Vygotsky's zone of proximal development using the theory terminology appropriately. Explain the parts of speech and different common speech mistakes children often make in early language development. Connect the development of memory with other developmental theories that we're learning about. Explain the concept of theory of mind in your own words. And then I want you to be able to identify and explain different examples or types of play. All right, let's get started. So early childhood, our book actually used to combine early childhood and middle childhood and would take them together across two different chapters. And so typically this chapter would have been early and middle childhood, and we'd be looking probably at cognitive development and physical development. And then the next chapter would have been early and middle childhood, looking over socioemotional development. And so in this revision of our textbook, the author decided, okay, hey, let's go ahead and split some of these things up. And she did that in the table of contents, but as we kind of go through the reading, we recognize that she still placed some of that middle childhood information into our reading for this week. So it's a little bit frustrating. So I'll try to help you be able to distinguish between what's early childhood and what's middle childhood from this chapter. And then when we move on to the next chapter where we're looking straight up at middle childhood, we can talk a little bit about that again. All right, so when we think about early childhood, the book in this revision says it's 3 years old up until the entry into formal schooling, or about 6 years old. I think specifically our book mentions kindergarten. Something that's kind of really interesting to me anyway is that not every state in the United States requires kindergarten. So for example, in Texas, their formal schooling actually starts as late as first grade because they're not required to put their kids in kindergarten. And so when we're thinking about early childhood, we're thinking, okay, 3 years old up until they go into school. So in previous revisions of this book, she actually had just the age range, and this was something new that she added, and I was really thankful for that because when we're dealing with these different developmental theories, or even with our stage theorists, we're more interested in looking at the characteristics of the stage than we are necessarily specific ages. And I know that can get frustrating. We all like to have very firm numbers, but for remembering early childhood, like we learned in the first week when we just briefly went over all the developmental phases, early childhood is 3 years old up until formal schooling. So now let's go ahead and set the context for studying early childhood. In this first part of the chapter, we look back at the psychosocial stages. Which theorist was famous for the development of psychosocial theory? If you said Erik Erikson, you are right. Great job. And so earlier we've learned about two other psychosocial stages before we moved on to this one. What was our first one? If you said trust versus mistrust, you are right. So after trust versus mistrust, what do our kiddos move on to? If you said the second stage is autonomy versus shame and doubt, you are right. Great job. And you'll want to keep going back through and practicing this because we're going to have a ton of stages by the time we get out of the semester. So our third stage for psychosocial stages will be initiative versus guilt. So I have a quote from Erik Erikson that I think adds a lot of value to your reading. So in this quote, it says, initiative adds to autonomy the quality of undertaking, planning, and attacking a task for the sake of being active and on the move, where before self-will, more often than not, inspired acts of defiance or, at any rate, protested independence. So that comes from Erik Erikson in 1995. So why don't you all discuss right now what you think that means? So after discussing initiative versus guilt, hopefully you all were able to resolve what the textbook meant by the definition that it gave. In initiative versus guilt, we're more interested in our ability to start planning a task, not necessarily being successful. That will be the next stage when we talk about it in middle childhood. But in initiative versus guilt, we're now interested in initiating purposefully some sort of task. Whereas when we were in autonomy versus shame and doubt, our whole task was learning to be independent people, not necessarily initiating tasks. Yes, in that stage, you see acts of defiance and temper tantrums. When we move into initiative versus guilt, then that's when we're getting into those more, I want to plan things, I want to test out my skills in this big, bad world of ours. So now we're going to move on to physical development. And in the book, it mentioned about a little bit about motor development, and we learned about two different types. What were those two types? So the first type we learned about was gross motor skills. This involved large and broad movements. What are some examples of gross motor skills? So if you said tasks like walking and running and biking, you are 100% correct. These are the different big, major, broad movements of motor skills that we have. If we have any physical therapists in this class, typically we do, you will typically be working with the gross motor skills. What was our second motor skill that we learned about in the reading? If you said fine motor skills, you're right. And these are those smaller, more intricate movements. This would be like what? If you said it's like writing or cutting with scissors, you are right. And so our occupational therapist in this class will be dealing a lot with these fine motor skills. And so often in schools, physical therapists, also known as PTs, or occupational therapists, known as OTs, will often work together as a team to provide services for children with special education services. And they will be a part of a multidisciplinary team that works to help make kids successful in school. So this moves us on to cognitive development. If you remember, cognitive development is the way that thinking progresses across the lifespan. And so far, we've gone over one stage. What was our first stage? If you said sensory motor stage, you are right. Yes, you're getting this. So in early childhood, we continue to move forward with some additional stages. So our second stage for this theory that was made famous by Piaget is called pre-operational stage. So this is again is the second stage of the theory of cognitive development. And in this stage, it's marked by an inability to step back from one's immediate perceptions and to think conceptually. So let's break that down a little bit. Let's think about what that means. Go ahead and feel free to discuss right now with your peers. When we think about pre-operational stage, we think that the kids actually have a hard time on focusing on more than one element at a time. And a lot of this, what this has to deal with is something called our working memory capacity. If you remember, working memory is the memory where as long as we're manipulating it and using it, we keep it in the forefront of our minds. However, once we stop manipulating the information, and if we don't encode it to store it in our long-term memory, we lose that information. So typically adults, at least in the United States, have about 7 slots in their working memory. This is plus or minus 2. So the typical working memory has about 5 to 9 slots or bins for them to put information into. When we're younger, we have as little as 2 slots, and then as we age up to age 7, we gain about 5 working memory slots. So when we're thinking about the pre-operational stage, it makes sense that kids have a hard time manipulating information or thinking about multiple elements at once, or being able to step back and look at things as a whole with a whole bunch of different elements, because they just don't have the working memory capacity to do so. And so this is why we have problems with something called centering in preoperational stage. So whenever we experience some sort of phenomenon, if we are able to use all 5 of our senses, typically there will be one of those senses that trumps all of our other ones. What sense do you think that is? Typically, it's going to be vision. So in preoperational stage, children will typically focus on the most visually striking or appealing element of something, and that's what they'll really hone in on and focus on. And so this can cause some trouble with things like conservation. So now I have a conservation tasks video that I would like y'all to watch. So I put all of the links to these videos in our Blackboard site for your convenience. I don't want to play the video through this presentation right here because I don't want to violate any copyright regulations on it. While you're working through the video though, I want you to think about what you're watching and then try to determine, is this child in preoperational stage or are they not in preoperational stage, based off what you know from our reading and based off of what you know from what we've learned so far about preoperational thinking. So you can just pause me here, go on into a new tab, and I will be waiting for you when you come back. Now that you've watched that video, hopefully you're able to see how the younger child had some trouble with conservation. And so that is one of the very hallmark symbols that a kid is in preoperational thinking. And so in this stage, children have a hard time understanding that the amount of something that you have stays the same even if you change its shape or even if you break it up into multiple pieces. So a lot of this has to deal with something called reversibility. And this concept within Piaget's theory is that once you do something to something, kids have a hard time thinking that you can take all of those things back. And that also still does with their working memory capacity at that age. One example I like to talk about with relation to this deals with graham crackers or cookies or juice. If any of y'all have ever worked in a preschool, you know that it's a very big deal that you make sure that you do what? So I don't know what y'all are going to write here because I am in the past at this point when I'm recording this, but hopefully somebody on our perusal or in our class was able to say, you got to make sure you have the same amount, or it looks like they have the same amount. So with graham crackers, this means that if you have big sheets of graham crackers, that you want to make sure that you give either whole graham crackers to children, or if you break them up into 2, that you make sure that you give every kid the broken ones up into 2. Because a problem that you could have with a kid in pre-operational stage is that if you give one kid one that's broken in half, and it looks like they have 2 pieces versus another kid having one whole graham cracker, is thinking that the other kid has more, even if it is exactly the same. And so part of that then is because the kids are only able to focus on the most visually striking thing, where they can see that there's physically 2 pieces versus 1. So I have another video for you from YouTube. This video is going to be on class inclusion. So from our reading, we learned that class inclusion is the struggle of pre-operational children to be able to understand that a broad category can have a bunch of smaller little categories as well. So a classic example that they used in the book was that if you had a whole bunch of Skittles and then a couple gummy bears stuffed in, and if you ask the kid, do you want Skittles or candy? A lot of times the kids are going to say Skittles because it's the most visually striking thing. And because they have issues with having limited working memory capacity, they don't remember that Skittles is a type of candy. Okay, so go ahead and watch that video and then come right back. Welcome back. You're not going to be here very long because I have another one of those videos for you. Hopefully you all really enjoy these videos. I think they're a lot more enlightening than just having me, yap on forever about what's in the chapter, which you all already read. So this video is going to be about identity constancy, even though you may not realize it at first. So if we remember from our reading, identity constancy is the pre-operational child's difficulty in realizing that people stay the same despite their appearance. So watch this video and then come back and discuss it in our assignment. Hopefully you enjoyed that last video. And I think it's really interesting because in the title, it says baby misses dad's beard. But if we really think about the baby's cognitive development and their working memory, the child's actually showing issues with identity constancy. And so when that happens, it's not that the kid misses her dad's beard. She doesn't realize that that's her dad. And so if you think of it from that perspective, it's a little bit more sad, but eventually the child will adapt and then be able to understand that that's her dad again. Okay, so I have another video. This one's going to be on animism. So if you remember from our reading, animism is a pre-operational child's tendency to believe that inanimate objects are alive. So if you ever had a little bear that you thought was alive or a doll that you thought was alive, many people are actually afraid of dolls because they look kind of creepy and they're afraid they're going to come to life and get them. And so if you've ever seen the Chucky movies, that's kind of where they drew inspiration from, is this pre-operational child's belief that inanimate objects can be alive. So I hope you enjoy this video. So the last thing that we're going to talk about with Piaget's theory, at least for this week, is that idea of egocentrism. And so usually when we think about egocentrism, it has a really negative connotation to it. When we're talking about pre-operational children, we're just basically saying that they're not able to see from someone else's point of view. And this actually can be really, 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 really sweet. Once I was really sick, and one of my kids brought me their favorite comfy blankie. So they did that not because I didn't have a blankie of my own, but because that blankie made them feel warm and comforted, and they wanted me to have that same experience. Does their blanket have the same meaning to them as it has with me? Probably not. I probably don't get as much comfort, but what I was comforted by was the gesture of them parting with their favorite blankie to try to make me feel better, right? And so if we look at egocentrism in that lens, I think it's not what we tend to think of when we say that someone's egocentric. And this won't be the last time that we talk about egocentrism. We'll actually hit this again later on in the year when we start talking about adolescence, and we'll look at adolescent egocentrism. I think it's really interesting because I'm not sure that people actually ever fully grow out of being egocentric, but we can try our best to do it. So that moves us on to our next topic, and we're going to talk about the zone of proximal development. You'll want to make sure that you're taking notes on this because the book doesn't tell the whole story about the zone of proximal development. So to get ready to talk about this, I would like to start with a quote. And as I read this quote, I want you to remember that Vygotsky actually studied quite a long time ago. And during that zeitgeist, they often use the pronoun he in their quotes. And so I just want us to recognize that they had a different zeitgeist and that this may not be the same language that they use today. But I do want to acknowledge that before I read this quote out loud. I know that the source on here says 2010. I took this quote from a different article that was published way after Vygotsky's death. Vygotsky actually died in the middle of such a very large breakthrough, and so he left a lot of his theory unfinished for himself when he died tragically young. And so this quote says, "What a child can do today in collaboration, tomorrow he will be able to do independently." And so what do you think about that quote? How do you think this applies to zone of proximal development? So like I said, the book does leave a lot of information out, and all the book talks about within the zone of proximal development theory, or ZPD for short, is just the actual zone of proximal development. So what I would like to do is actually expose you all to more of the theory, because there's actually 3 different zones that we learn about. We have the zone of actual development, the zone of proximal development, and the zone of insurmountable difficulty. So in the zone of actual development, these are all the tasks that you can do on your own with zero help from other people. What are some of those tasks? For me, I can tie my shoe. That's in my zone of proximal, or my zone of actual development. So in the next part of the theory, the zone of proximal development, these are tasks that you can accomplish with the help of others. So in my spare time, I am in a rock and roll band, for example. And so I can songwrite and write tons of songs, but I still need the help of a producer to get my songs ready for the radio. Okay, so until I am able to fully, record, produce, arrange, mix and master, I'm still learning those things, and I have people who show me how to do them. And so that is part of my zone of proximal development, because I need someone else helping show me how to do different things and how to do them right. So what are some things that are in your zone of proximal development? Things that you can accomplish if you have some sort of master learner helping you reach your goal. So our third zone for this theory is the zone of insurmountable difficulty. So these are the things that you cannot accomplish, and it doesn't matter how much help you have, you can't do it. For me, this is astrophysics right now. No matter how much help I have or whoever's helping me, there's no way I can do that right now. I could do it maybe one day if I have some of my learning scaffolded, which we'll talk about in a minute, but as of right now, I can't do that. Or if you take a kindergartner, because of where their cognitive development is, will not be able to do calculus most likely, because their brain development's not quite there yet. So that would be in their zone of insurmountable difficulty. So it's really important as we go through and we study this, that we're able to distinguish, okay, what is in the zone of actual development, what's in the zone of proximal development, and what's in the zone of insurmountable difficulty. And so distinguish among those and tell me who the theorist for this theory is, and that was Vygotsky. So a part of Vygotsky's theory is he believed that we construct meaning through social relationships. So things that are in your zone of proximal development, you can have this master learner who can scaffold your development. So let's look at the word scaffold. So when we hear scaffold, a lot of times I think about scaffolding around something to support it. And that's exactly what it is, but with learning. So for example, some students in my statistics class, some of them could do statistics without me. That's in their zone of actual development. But there's quite a few students that might have statistics in their zone of proximal development, and that's why they need me as an instructor to help scaffold their learning in different ways. Eventually, hopefully, it's my hope as a faculty member that these students will be able to move that from their zone of proximal development, because I've helped scaffold their learning enough that eventually that moves down into their zone of actual development. So after the zone of proximal development, we move on to language development. So this chapter goes over some very basic language elements. The first thing that it talks about are phonemes, and phonemes are basically the smallest unit of sound in a language. So a lot of children in schools will learn about phonemic awareness, and that's how they teach kids to read. So this would be, I don't know if y'all have ever heard of Leapfrog, but they have a show called Letter Factory, and it'll be like A says ah, A says ah. So when we're in schools, a lot of times what we'll do is we'll teach kindergartners their letter sounds. And we know that some letters have more than one sound, right? So like A has a short and a long sound, but the phonemes are just those individual letter sounds, and that predicts the ability for children to be able to read more fluently. And so this is a really systematic way teaching phonemic awareness, or the phonemes, along with high frequency sight words that you may not be able to sound out, so that we can get kids to read. Something else that you learned about in the reading was morphemes, and these are the smallest units of meaning in language. So I remember when I was in graduate school, one of my professors said the way that she studied for her GRE, which is basically the ACT, SAT to get into graduate school, she said the way that she studied was to break words down into their basic units of meaning, and she learned all these prefixes, suffixes, and root words, and she was able to use that information to guess what words meant on the GRE. So if we're talking about the word, I guess the books use the word boys, right? That has two morphemes to it. It has boy, which means, you know, a male child, and then S at the end, which is the suffix, which means it's plural. So that means there's multiple boys. Sometimes in this class, you'll actually see me break down words for you. That's what I do in this class, and I also do that in my statistics class, because sometimes it just makes sense to break down words into their morphemes so that we can remember them more freely. And then the mean length of utterance is the mean number of morphemes that a child uses in each sentence. Syntax then are all those grammar rules that you learn. I sound fancy, don't I? But syntax are kind of the rules of language, while semantics deals more with meaning. So if you've ever heard someone say it's all about semantics, they're saying that what is being said really relates to what those words are meaning. And we know, especially in American English, that semantics becomes very important, because the way that we say things may not always mean what we actually say. And that's why sometimes American English can be really difficult for some people to learn as a second language. Okay, and so there's some early language errors that kids have. One is overregulation. This is where they overuse different things like suffixes like the S, right? So instead of saying feet, they say foots. And this is something that happens all the time. Sometimes we'll see overextensions. So that would be like a child calling every old man grandpa. So they're out and they just see someone they don't know and be like, grandpa. So they're overextending the meaning of the word. And then if we took this and we used the same example, but for underextension, if someone said that their grandpa is only their grandpa, that no one else can have a grandpa because grandpa is their grandpa and can be nobody else. So in our Blackboard site, you'll see that I have a speech and language development milestones resource and checklist. That's a really cool website. It's not required for anything, but I have it in there so that you can go in and look at it, especially if you're planning on working with kids. If you're going to be some sort of early childhood educator, that can be really important to have. If you're going to be a parent or are a parent, or you're just going to work with children in any context, that might be really important for you to have. To see kind of where the kids are with their speech and language developmental milestones. So now we also are going to talk about emotional development a little bit. One of the things that the book talks about includes autobiographical memory. So these are the memories that we have that are related to past events that occurred in our life. So kind of like an autobiography. Something that's really interesting is that if you get into studying cognitive psychology, so the brain and memory and how it functions, we actually are not really great recorders of our own memory, and there's so many different things that bias the way that we think about things, the way that we remember things. A lot of times I will do an activity where I help plant a false memory into my student's mind as just an activity that I do in class sometimes, so that we can see how fragile our memory actually is. And so it's just really interesting. In my field of research in suicidology, this is really, really problematic, because there'll be studies done where they have some sort of like smartwatch or actiograph, and people will report when they're having suicidal thoughts or suicidal behaviors. And then at the end of the study, whether it's been a month or however long, they'll look back and have people mention whether or not they've had suicidal thoughts or not. And even though they reported it in the moment when they had suicidal thoughts and behaviors, when they get to the end of the study and they're having to think back through that whole experience, they're finding that they don't remember ever having these suicidal thoughts. And so as a researcher who wants to help develop interventions to help people reframe their thoughts, and problem solve things in their lives so that they're not having to experience suicidal thoughts and behaviors, that's really frightening for me because the tools that we have to measure these things are all what we call retrospective self-reports. And so retrospective self-reports are just that. You just look back in your memory and you try to write down what happened or score what happened, and we find out they're not really reliable, and they're not consistent at all. And so that's just something that's really interesting to talk about. So we also have the theory of mind that we talked about in this. And the theory of mind, that begins around age 4. And this is where people start to realize that other people have different thoughts or different opinions than they do. And so up until this point, kids have no idea that other people have other thoughts. And it's kind of funny because we start developing this around age 4, but sometimes I think people have to struggle with this throughout their whole life. I think we've seen that a lot recently, even within this past year or so, that we see people really, really struggle with this theory of mind concept. We also have social development. So play is what we're going to talk about with this. And we see exercise play. So this is play where kids are, like it sounds, exercising while they play. So this could be tag, this could be playing hide and seek where you have to run from the person who's trying to find you, or it could be racing, things like that. We also have rough and tumble play. So this is play that's a little bit more rough and rowdy. So this is like our wrestling or playing Power Rangers or something like that. The purpose of this play is not to hurt other people, though, so that's something to keep in mind in distinguishing whether this is rough and tumble play or if it's aggression. So rough and tumble play is just that. It's just roughhousing. We also have fantasy play. So this is just where kids use their imaginations and make believe. So sometimes you'll see, oh man, this is probably not a thing anymore. I saw a TikTok on this where you say, hey kid, how do you hold a phone? Y'all can do this right now. How would you hold a phone if you're pretending you had a phone in your hand and you didn't? So a lot of the younger generation now will do this, whereas my generation, where we had phones that plugged into the wall, will do this. Okay, so pretending different things are phones. It could be a hand, it could be some sort of object that you see. And so that's fantasy play. We also have collaborative pretend play, and that's where you play with other people, play house, play school, all these different types of things where you're playing in groups of kids. So if a kid is not developing fantasy play or collaborative pretend play, sometimes we get a little bit concerned that maybe the kid has autism spectrum disorder. And the only reason why we get concerned with that is that we may need to find some additional supports so that the kid can be successful in a world that's geared toward neurotypical people. We also have gender segregated play, and so this is just where people tend to play with children that they identify with their gender. So a lot of times traditionally they would say, if you've ever seen like Little Rascals where they say no stinking girls can come in, that is an example of gender segregated play, which is really interesting because kids aren't like that in the very beginning, and then they segregate into genderized play groups, and we get into adolescence then where we have to look at how play changes with that. I mean, we even have different ways that we play as adults, right? So it may not look the same. It may be a hobby. It may be joining a biking club. It may be joining a rock band or a bowling league, but we still play across the lifespan, even as we get to being an adult. So that's all I have for you today. Hopefully this lecture was helpful. I have all those links in our Blackboard site, and these are my references. So I hope you have a great week. Bye.